Of Professor Anthony Rafferty, it's very nice. So this series of events is an opportunity in the business school to welcome new and newly promoted colleagues and to celebrate their successes. During the pandemic, they provided us with an opportunity to connect with colleagues and support one another, as well as sharing our research with a global audience online. We are now moving to a hybrid format, so I am pleased to welcome you in person here in this in-house audience. And we also have a very substantial audience today online. I think something like 280 colleagues have registered. So welcome to everybody who is online. And it's really delightful to see an audience of that size, which is testimony to, of course, Anthony's reputation. So Anthony is a Professor of Employment Studies here at Alliance Manchester Business School. His current research focuses on labour market inequalities and understanding the implications for organisational and management practices with reference to sustainable and inclusive growth. Anthony is a recognised international expert on issues surrounding the statistical measurement and monitoring of the labour market. He is a member of the Economic and Social Research Council's Peer Review College. He has undertaken advisory roles and research consultancy for a variety of organisations, including the UN International Labour Organization, the European Institute for Gender Equality, the UK Commission for Skills and Employment, the European Foundation, and a variety of UK research councils. He has acted as an invited expert advisor to the UK government on employment and welfare reform issues, giving oral evidence to the House of Commons Work and Pension Select Committee. Prior to joining AMBS, Anthony worked as a researcher at the Cathy Marsh Institute for Social Research in the Department of Social Statistics in the School of Social Sciences here at Manchester. So Anthony was recently appointed as Managing Director of the Work and Equalities Institute, one of three institutes within the business school. He took over the role from Professor Jill Rubery, who has become Executive Director and who will maintain or have responsibilities for the Institute's international networks. And I am delighted that Jill is here today and she is going to be facilitating the discussion. The agenda of the Work and Equalities Institute is to identify and promote the conditions for more inclusive and fair work and employment arrangements in the UK and beyond. The Institute develops world-leading interdisciplinary research focused around four key themes: business transformation and work futures, fair treatment at work, inequalities and the life course, and regulation and representation. So the title of Anthony's lecture today is Skill-underutilisation and Discrimination in the Labour Market, Why it Matters and What Can Be Done About It. Using evidence from around 30 European countries, Anthony will discuss whether workplace discrimination leads to the underutilisation of skill and human potential, how it can be harmful to the individual and society, but also to business performance and productivity. He's going to be giving specific attention to how discrimination may affect also the quality of line-manager relationships, and will consider the implications for leadership and broader people management practices. There will be plenty of time towards the end of today's sessions for your questions, a question and answer session. If you're in the room, to which you all are here, please raise your hand and we will come to you in turn. If you are watching online, please type in your questions into the chat function so that we can, as you go through the event, you don't have to save them all up to the end. Do put them into that, as I say, the chat function as we go along. And we have a colleague here in the room who will pose your question for Anthony in due course. So let's get started, and I'm delighted to hand over to Anthony now. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Great, so thank you very much, Fiona, for that very comprehensive introduction. I think I'll look at that. I need to update my CV for some of those things.
Pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone who's come to join us today in the room. This has been moved on to a hybrid kind of seminar, so it's good to see you all here. It's particularly a warm welcome to our guests that are joining online as well. I think it was great to see, how much interest there was in this topic. I wouldn't say it's just me, but the topic I think is an important one. It's quite encouraging to see that there's so much interest in it online as well. So as Fiona mentioned then, what I want to talk about today is some of my research, which is on skill underutilisation, but particularly about how discrimination in the labour market could affect skill underutilisation and what we can do about it. So we're going to focus on organisational issues surrounding line managers and so forth, as Fiona introduced. Before we get there, though, I've probably got a question for people joining us online just to think about. Have you ever felt too good for your job? So have you ever done a job sometime in the past, or maybe it's your job now, that you might have felt under-recognised for? Maybe you felt like you had potential in that job, but you didn't get the right training, you were underdeveloped. Or it might be a skills mismatch, just simply that the skills that you had and the interests you had were different to your job. But I guess what we're talking about here is about underutilisation in some ways, and maybe training deficits as well, and about skill and talent being underused. I put this picture onto the side here of Kai Ming-ji, who actually wrote a book about being overeducated. So another topic here we're talking about is about the idea of overeducation, having qualifications in excess of what you might need for your job. Kai Ming-ji is from China, and he has a PhD in molecular biology and worked for 8 years or so as a scientist, but then lost his job and couldn't find a job. And after a few kind of different kind of applications for jobs, decided to become a taxi driver. So it's a very kind of extreme example of a person with a PhD driving a taxi around the streets of Singapore and claiming to be the most educated cab driver. Now, I guess some of our kind of examples of what might have happened there, just say there was a film made out of it as well. I have to admit, I've not watched the film. I'm sure it's as good as the book. But basically, it's a very extreme example, perhaps. We could all think about maybe how we felt in that type of a job. Maybe it was early on in our careers and so forth. Maybe we moved on, or maybe we're still in those type of roles. And that's what we're kind of talking about here today, is one of the reasons why you might feel too good for your job. And it's what I'm referring to broadly as skills-related underemployment. So looking at these two statements here, thinking about that job, if you agreed with the first statement, I have the skills to cope with more demanding duties, that's what we might refer to with skill underutilisation. So the idea you've got skills, crucially they're not being used, but they're out for more demanding duties as well. If you agreed with the second statement here, when you thought about that job, I need further training to cope well with my duties, we might think of that as skill underdevelopment or a training deficit. So this is basically the idea again that your potential is not being met because your workplace is effectively not providing you the training or resources to fulfill your potential. And just to say, these questions are from the European Working Conditions Survey, which is the main survey I'm going to present findings from today. So that's just a bit of a preamble what we mean by skill underemployment. And what I wanted to do today is to make three basic claims. So firstly, I'm going to interrogate the idea that skill-related underemployment is an everyday phenomenon. So you might say, it exists in the economy, in the labour market, people experience this, but is it a problem or not? Is it just a fact of economic life? The second claim I'm going to make here, well, the first claim is that, yes, it does matter. The second claim I'm going to make is that some people are more likely to experience it than others. And reasons of inequality and discrimination are a reason why people might be more likely to have that feeling of being too good for their job. Then finally, I want to make the claim that skill underemployment when it is linked to discrimination, is a management and leadership issue. And think about some of the ways in which the behaviour of managers and leaders within organisations might create such forms of underutilisation, and focus on this idea of gatekeeping. So to jump right in there, just on the first claim, so skill-related underemployment is an everyday phenomenon. Now, before we do that, I just wanted to mention briefly that the focus of my talk today is more on the organisational implications of skill underutilisation. But there is a broader policy context to this issue. So the idea of skill underutilisation is recognised in international labour market monitoring. It has a long history. So you can at least trace this back with the International Labour Organization to debates in the 1970s. And indeed, some of my initial research on this was when I was acting as an expert advisor in the tripartite meeting of experts on the measurement of decent work, which was around 2008. Now, what I would argue, although it's recognised as an issue, perhaps there's not as much attention given to it as should be. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's quite difficult to actually measure. So one of the omissions from my talk today is I'm not going to go into those measurement issues for reasons of time, but there are a variety of ways of measuring it, and we're going to think about self-reported measures here. Just to say another omission, just for reasons of pure intellectual honesty, I'm not going to talk today about the broader institutional context, but there is an institutional context to these issues. For example, the OECD has looked at differences in skill mismatch and to consider whether it's shaped by public policy and institutional context. I'll mention these in passing, but it's not going to be the focus today. And finally, just to say the other thing that's probably should be on the kind of the menu for this type of discussion is about spatial inequalities. So we have the Skills for Jobs white paper and debates regarding things such as levelling up. Indeed, we have some research going on with the Productivity Institute looking at these issues. So these mismatches between skills, there is a spatial dimension there. And indeed, if you listen to Boris Johnson's closing speech of the Conservative Party, there's very much a lot of talk about levelling up opportunities across the countries and utilising people's skills and talents and so forth. So it's there kind of implicitly within the policy discourse there. But as I say, the main focus today is going to be on the more organisational context of this. So the claim then that skill underutilisation is an everyday phenomenon, the first place I might look is at some of the statistical evidence. So using the EWCS, the European Working Conditions Survey, in the UK, around 36% of employees report having skills for more demanding duties. Now, you could say that's an employee self-report, but what's interesting as well, when we look at the employer skills survey, around 34% of employers also report something similar. So they report having staff who have both qualifications and skills that are more advanced than required for their current role. So there seems to be kind of a bit of a consensus for employees and employers that there is an issue here with around just over 1/3 of employees reporting this. So that's the first bit to say it could be seen as an everyday occurrence in the economy and the labour market. And just in passing to note as well, if we look at the 30 or so countries that are in the EWCS survey, on this question, you can see that the UK scores quite highly compared to international comparators. So it is an issue in the UK, and the figures we report are quite considerably higher than many other kind of European countries. So again, I'm not getting into the institutional context here, but there are maybe issues here as well to know about the UK. So I guess what I wanted to do before jumping into the main part of the discussion is to think about this idea of maybe it's just an everyday phenomenon or something that's a natural fact of economic life. So there are a number of kind of arguments you could make here. Firstly, you could say it's a normal part of people's employment careers. So we know that younger people are more likely to experience skill underutilisation. And perhaps over time, as they move between jobs, as they kind of gain more experience in the labour market, they might move into positions that more recognise their abilities and skills. This is what we might call kind of job shopping, people moving between jobs. Now, that's an interesting argument, but I guess one thing we do know is that people's employment trajectories aren't necessarily always that orderly. It's not necessarily just this kind of upward progression in the labour market. And we also know there might be things in people's lives across the life course that happen where people kind of move down as well as up. We think about downward occupational mobility. For example, somebody returning to employment after a period of maternity, taking on a lower skilled part-time job due to a lack of childcare availability would be an example where at a point in the life course, you can't see trajectories, just this continual upward path. So the first argument doesn't convince me that it's just an everyday thing we should just kind of ignore, I guess. The second point, I guess you could say, well, it's just a natural consequence of supply and demand changes for qualifications. So it's unavoidable as well as demands for qualifications shift and an expansion of the higher education sector, for example. Now, this argument, again, doesn't take into account that these things don't naturally seem to kind of adjust out, that the demand for qualifications in itself continues to be strong. And the argument here is that it's not necessarily a bad thing as well, because you might have valuable generic skills. So think about a law graduate. So a person who's done a law degree might not become a lawyer. There might be an excess supply of lawyers for training contracts. Well, that's not to say that those people don't go on to do other jobs and use many of the more transferable, generic or skills within those jobs. But here we might have crowding out effects where people with higher qualifications move into jobs where people used to have low qualifications and pushes out those people. So that in its sense means that underutilisation may have effects on people who are not even underutilised. And this argument also doesn't explain why different people are more likely to be experiencing things like overqualification or not. So the first two arguments don't convince me too greatly. Finally, another argument is that skill underutilisation is a natural consequence of industrial change, of technological change and economic change. So it's inevitable as technology moves on that you might get skill obsolescence. So essentially, if you look at the pictures on the left here, a person like myself growing up in Greater Manchester knows of the disused mills of Manchester quite well. It was by a hazardous playground of my youth at one point. But I think you can see that in Manchester itself, deindustrialisation causes shifts in demands for skills. We can also think about these debates going forward in terms of automatisation and so forth, and robotics. So you might say that this is a bit of a fatalistic argument, to say, oh, it's just a consequence of some form of technological progress, but we also need to think about the people and the communities that might be left behind by these changes. And also this is a policy issue in terms of how governments respond to these great transformations, in terms of, how do they reskill, and issues such as like lifelong learning and reskilling in the labour market. So I think, some of those kind of arguments that it's kind of a more benign aspect of the economy, they have kind of problems with them. Now, there's other reasons as well why you might think skill underutilisation is a problem, something that we need to think about. So firstly, we could argue that it's a productivity issue. So there's a lot of focus on human capital and how that's used in organisations, but I guess we also need to think about the matching between workers and jobs. So you think about kind of job matching theories, back to the idea we said about a person moving through their career through jobs, maybe over time through a sequence of matches, they find a job that better matches their skills on. But what we might argue, for example, Black in the Journal of Labour Economics in 1995 tried to bring this idea of frictions in matching. So essentially that, something like discrimination could stop the matching process or be a barrier to matching, essentially. So what we're saying here is that productivity, to an extent, is a function of the match between the worker and the job. So having the person with the right skills in the right job, that's going to be the most productive match. Whereas discrimination might end up with the person in the job who isn't the best person for that job. And that's going to be kind of a lower point of productivity than if you had a better match. And I guess just drawing on some of that kind of work by OECD for a moment in terms of international differences, there might be issues here about kind of job design and management practices as well. So our jobs through kind of decline and discretion being designed in ways that reduces skill utilization. Again, some of this may be from technology change. We think about clerical work, how that's changed and things like this. But the basic issues here, making it a management issue in terms of how we utilize skills and how workers are managed and how jobs are designed. So that's why it's an important issue as well. And finally, just to say, it's also a well-being issue. So overqualification has also been linked to greater depressive symptoms, migrant poverty amongst, and other kind of like negative outcomes. So just to summarize the first point then, so is it an everyday phenomenon? Yes, but why more so in some countries than others? It's non-trivial. The skills matches could be important well-being and productivity issues. And also for the future of work kind of debates, these issues of skill obsolescence and need for reskilling. Effectively, policy responses could be seen as a failure if they don't adequately deal with those kind of transformations. So the main claim we're going to make then is this idea that some people are more likely to experience skill-related underemployment than others. So just to start with some real-life stories. So a woman was awarded £90,000, it's Owen Ronalden, forgive the pronunciations, because she missed out on a promotion to a male candidate despite being better qualified. So this is from, there's different places we can look for evidence of discrimination, we can think about statistics, we can think of kind of field experiments, but we can also look at real life cases. What's interesting about the first case is it does bring this idea that she was better qualified. So the idea of being overqualified, skill underutilization is kind of in there. The second case, an 9-year-old NHS secretary became the oldest person in the UK to win an age discrimination claim, being fired for not being able to use a modern computer, but the ruling suggested that there was evidence of the claimant's training not being inadequate or being inadequate. Yeah. So here you might see the training deficit issue, that somebody who was elderly, perhaps seen on the edge of retirement, was not given the right tools and training to be able to fulfill their job. So our two factors of underemployment kind of come out of these two examples. Now, most of the academic research on this has focused more on issues around ethnic penalties or ethnic minority penalties in terms of overeducation or differences between migrant and non-migrant workers. So there's less kind of research on other types of protected characteristics. And I guess a lot of this research focuses on understanding what the gaps are in terms of overqualification after controlling for other individual factors. And the problem with this type of research broadly is that there might be other unobserved things that are kind of explain those residual gaps. So for example, in terms of migrant penalties, it might be kind of language abilities or the credentials of qualifications from different countries, or host or sending factors. So also kind of a host factor would be the point at which they migrated and the industries that they became embedded in. So what I wanted to focus on is this paper I did in 2018, which rather than inferring discrimination from kind of labour market gaps, takes a more direct measure of discrimination, simply asking people, are you discriminated against? And seeing whether they're more likely to be overqualified. And also this paper, it extends into past research because we're looking at a broader range of protected characteristics. Now, of course, there's also some problems. This approach, clearly self-reported information, if anything, it probably underestimates the levels of discrimination because the discrimination has to be on a level that is overt enough for people to actually acknowledge it. And you know, we know that many forms of discrimination are more covert or insidious, but it does still kind of produce some interesting findings. So the black line here is where people reported no discrimination. And we can see over a range of characteristics where people reported discrimination based on nationality, the racial ethnic background, religion, related to the age, sex, or sexual orientation, that there's higher levels of skill underutilization reported. And this is that statement again, they're agreeing with, I have the skills to cope with more demanding duties. Now, of course, there may be other differences in terms of demographic characteristics, watch the purple lights, in terms of why there might be these differences. So what we try to do is control for some of these kind of differences. So, for example, we're in a kind of a multinomial logic context here, what we're kind of controlling for is things like differences in qualification levels. Clearly, you've got more qualifications, you might be more likely to be at risk. We're controlling for things like whether a person is a migrant or non-migrant, and their tenure, maybe your work experience, as we said, is linked to the, kind of a risk of overqualification or skill utilization, underutilization in this case. But even after controlling for a range of things, we still find that, for example, women, these are predicted probabilities, so we can just read them roughly as kind of percentages. About 7.4% more people who report sex discrimination, sorry, about 7.4% more likely to report skill underutilization. And the orange one here is the training deficits as well. We can see across a range of kind of forms of discrimination, people are more likely to report that they don't receive appropriate or they don't receive sufficient training. So it's the first bit of kind of direct evidence where people saying they're kind of discriminated against are also saying that there are these kind of barriers to kind of fulfilling their potential. Maybe that feeling that we said that, that they're kind of better than what their job allows them to be. So just to summarize on that second point, some people are more likely to experience skill underemployment than others. Discrimination is linked to skills mismatches, but based on this evidence that suggests that, at least, supports that view. People reporting discrimination, though, are more likely to report both skill underutilization. Some people report that, whereas others actually report unmet training needs as well. So that they might have training needs that are not being met in the organisation. And it's important to note that these penalties, as we're calling them, persist after controlling for a range of characteristics as well. So the final claim then, skill underemployment linked to discrimination is a management and leadership issue. Now, firstly, I've got to kind of say that in this table we've just presented, we've grouped lots of different forms of discrimination together, and clearly different forms of discrimination have varying social, organisational, and individual causes. And it's not in the kind of the scope of this lecture to appreciate all those differences. And they also may intersect. For example, gender and ethnicity might produce specific forms of discrimination. So I'm going to focus in on this kind of organisational level issues and argue, despite this, there are some potential commonalities in terms of the management and leadership issues. So the first kind of place I've looked is in some of the kind of sociological literature on this. For example, Harris, or sociologically inspired literature that Harris and O'Connor in 2015 did a qualitative study looking at this idea of ethnic gatekeeping. And the idea here was that basically, in terms of there was people's social identities and how that formed into group behaviours. So they suggested that there was kind of, you could have potentially direct gatekeeping, where a line manager gives differential treatment to people in terms of resources in an organisation, whether it's something like training or promotion. Or you can think about gatekeeping in terms of recruitment, that you might recruit certain people implicitly based upon discriminatory attitude than others. So there are lots of gates, or organisations are full of what we might call opportunity gates. And the question is about who monitors those gates, who controls those gates, and who's allowed through and who's not. There are other perspectives as well. For example, the relational inequalities theory talks about this idea of social closure, how people make claims for resources and organisations. Now, this can have exclusionary practices. But even in kind of more mainstream organisational behaviour literatures and leadership literature, such as on leader member exchange theory, you can still see these type of issues there as well. So leader member exchange theory is about the kind of the quality of the relationships. So for example, consider a team where there's a leader and a number of members. What's the quality of the different dyadic relationships between the leader and the team members? Yeah. And what factors shape those relationship qualities? And So things like social similarity or dissimilarity might affect that. Now, a lot of that literature is focused on individual level similarity and dissimilarity, but we can also say that in a discriminatory context, group membership or at least social identities could also shape those kind of exchanges of resources and support. So just to kind of flesh out that a bit more, just to simplify a little bit as well. So here we have the idea of kind of an in-group and an out-group. So an in-group would be a group where the members of the team are kind of treated more favourably. So in effect, there's a positive treatment. But this can also lead to kind of a withdrawal or withholding resources to people who are the out-group. Now, of course, we've all worked in teams. It's not just about discrimination. There's lots of reasons why these relationships can be different. Well, the question here is whether discrimination could be a cause of poor quality leader-member exchange. And the argument is that whereas the favoured group might get additional support or improve morale, it might boost their commitment or improve their job performance, the out-group in turn might have a lower morale in the workplace, a less jobs commitment, and it might indeed kind of lower their job performance if they're not given the right support and resources to perform their job. So I don't have any direct kind of measures of LMX on here, but using European Working Conditions Survey and focus on the UK here, what we can look at is some of the questions on managerial support. So essentially, across a range of kind of questions, what we've got here is the extent to which people agree or strongly disagree, with these statements. So, and we can see some of the gaps are actually quite big. So we can, in orange here, we've got people who reported, for the purposes here, any form of discrimination, whereas in blue, they didn't report any discrimination. Okay. And we can see, that the orange lines much less likely to disagree, or not less likely to agree, shall we say, with these statements. So regarding your line manager or supervisor, do they encourage and support development? Do they provide useful feedback? Are they helpful in getting the job done? Successful in getting people to work together? Give praise and recognition for a good job? And respect you as a person? And we can think about a lot of these behaviours are quite linked to kind of facilitatory leadership behaviours that help people develop and reach their potential in the workforce. And what we're basically saying here, it would appear from the evidence that people reporting discrimination report less of that interaction being positive. And just a final piece of evidence I wanted to kind of share is there also seems to be issues of trust or even psychological safety around this as well. So again, people reported discrimination in orange, no reported discrimination in blue. And you can see that with statements like employees generally trust management, there's good cooperation between you and your colleagues, work is distributed fairly, conflicts are resolved fairly, management trusts employees to do the work, and employees are appreciated for good work. There's quite substantial gaps again in terms of people who report discrimination or say that they've not experienced discrimination. And there's some interesting things here about trust, but one thing here is about work being distributed fairly. So you could think about how a line manager allocates tasks to people. And the tasks that you might be allocated, some might have more opportunities for development than others. So it's not just about the job you're doing, it's about the tasks in the job. Who gets the positions and the contracts or the projects that are going to help them more, and who doesn't. So just to finish off on that, some takeaways from this. I guess this idea of gatekeeping is quite interesting here, or opportunity gates. And the question is, who is watching the opportunity gates? Who is controlling them as well? And we can think in organisations there might be a variety of points of intervention. So beyond the focus on things like pay gaps and representation in organisations, we can think about recruitment is another thing organisations think about, also performance management outcomes. Promotion outcomes, training and development opportunities or talent management programs. There's various areas in terms of working life which could be considered to be in terms of gates of opportunity that managers might have some control over who accesses or who gets through to an extent. And also I mentioned this idea of work allocation and job design issues. Well, I think the second takeaway from this is that it's not just about hard outcomes that we monitor in terms of things like pay gaps and so forth, or recruitment. It's also about more kind of softer outcomes. So if we're thinking about some of that evidence in terms of the managerial support, understanding informal processes of support from managers, how employees feel in teams, engagement scores and things like this can also be used to think about these more informal aspects. So something like coaching behaviours and so forth. Are people being supported in the teams appropriately? And I guess the issue of trust is there as well. So one of the questions suggested that, you know, there was a perception that people who experience discrimination feel like disputes are not settled well in the organisation. So what's the disputes and grievance procedures? How are they dealt with fairly? Is there psychological safety about people speaking up about these type of issues in the organisation as well? So just to kind of conclude then, what I've tried to argue today then is that skill underemployment is fairly common, but discrimination appears to increase the risk of you experiencing it. Now that might be at the point of recruitment, but it also can be within the organisations in terms of the behaviour of line managers with existing staff and these kind of talent or these kind of opportunity gates that exist within the organisation. And I guess this hopefully provides a further business case for effective equality, diversity, inclusion policy in the workplace. Because effectively what we can argue here is that discrimination is a business concern if the right people are not getting into the right jobs and if talent isn't being developed to its full potential in your organisation. So there's the importance of monitoring this stuff, and that indeed that agenda has grown considerably, but perhaps we need to go beyond some more traditional measures to thinking more broadly about other points of gatekeeping in organisations and these softer outcomes in terms of line manager behaviour. I guess as levels of kind of diversity increase in the workforce, it might be at these other points where the issues become more prominent rather than just at the point of recruitment. So the question is, you know, if organisations do have kind of things like equality and diversity training, which is increasingly commonplace, are these really embedded in action plans, in leadership practice? What's the tone from the top? Are the leaders giving support to these type of issues? But also, rather than being an add-on, it should be part of a discussion about workforce development and a discussion about kind of the more facilitatory role of leaders in organisations. And hopefully that's a way where focusing on workforce development issues, perhaps you can kind of couch EDI within broader discussions of facilitatory leadership, rather than just seeing it as a kind of a thing that's on the side or an extra. It's core to the very idea of developing the workforce and harnessing the potential of your workforce. So just to kind of go back to those kind of thoughts you might have had or not had about that job at the start where you felt under kind of utilised, hopefully we can all agree that, you know, the aspiration for a society and an economy where everybody has the opportunity to fulfil their potential is something that we could call aspire to. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. Right, we're going to have, we've got about 20 minutes, I think, for question and answers. And I think what we'll do is we'll take 2 questions from the audience here, the face-to-face audience, and then I'll turn to Jim Pendrell, who will field 2 questions from the Zoom audience, and we'll carry on as far as we can. So can I take anybody who'd like to start off in the audience? Perhaps you could say who you are as well as posing your question.
I'll start off.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know who I am. But Fiona Devine, head of Alliance Manchester Business School. So I was just thinking about the issue of the data and it being self-reported data now. There's challenges to self-reported data, isn't there? And as with all data, there's pros and cons, and sometimes you just have to find other sources of data to make up with the shortcomings of data that you're working with. So I just wondered if there is other research out there that is really being able to embrace, in a way, sort of both sides of the story. And maybe I would say this as a manager, but just sort of thinking about issues to do with, yeah, an employee might report something, but an employer or a line manager or a team manager might report something else. And of course, you know, you have a mix of, in any workforce, where some people might have inflated views of their skills, but also you have plenty of people that are extremely modest about their skills and how that's all managed. So I'm just wondering, is there the research out there which, you know, can kind of supplement all the work that, the nice work that's done here, but also makes up for some of the limitations in terms of self-reported data?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so I think the issue of data, I mean, firstly, if we assume the second point first, that there may be differences in people's self-efficacy beliefs, and some people might think they're better than perhaps they are, yeah, or some people might kind of be more modest about their abilities. There's no reason to assume that that wouldn't be kind of like stochastically distributed across the economy. So what you would have, on the point of discrimination, what you would have to say is, well, why would that happen for a certain protected group rather than another group? So I agree with the point that they kind of across the economy, you may have these what we might call measurement error in some respects, but there's no reason to assume that that would have some kind of systematic pattern to it. So I think that'll be a short answer to the second point. On the first point, I guess there's lots of different ways you can look at discrimination in the labour market. Indeed, self-report's one way. We can think about field experiments, for example, sending CVs out. We can also think about, in terms of changing names on CVs and things like that. We can think about big data, so we can crunch data within organisations to see whether there are systematic patterns as well, in terms of things like line manager outcomes, evaluations by the staff or promotions and stuff like that. And as I mentioned as well, another place we can look is in terms of kind of like case law outcomes as well, where there's been some kind of at least an external judgment on what happened as well, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, Steve.
I'm Stephen Overell. I'm a PhD student here at the university, and I also work for Greater Manchester Local Authority. I was wondering if we could have two, if that's allowed. So one of them is about policy implications. So you started off by saying it is skills underutilisation is a policy issue for various reasons, through productivity and well-being. So the policy response, so in your conclusions, you're identifying kind of managerial responses. What might be the policy response to address skills underutilisations? That's one. And my second, if that's okay, is just, I was just wondering about what might be further research, which would be to kind of prove your case by organisations that have EDI policies and invest in managerial development and leadership and all that stuff. Do they do better on skills utilisation? Is it possible to kind of go that way and prove that case?
It's two questions. Maybe Jill, you can take the second one, but
that's okay.
Great. Yes, good questions again on the first question in terms of this distinction between what the policy implications are and what the managerial implications. I've not done any work directly on that, but I refer you to the work, for example, by the OECD that looked at this. And one of the kind of arguments was that in environments that support better managerial practices and in organisations, the link between skill underutilisation and poor productivity is lower. I mean, it's a weak, there's not much research around this, but some of the research suggests this. So essentially, this would go along the argument that if an organisation has kind of good management practices, then essentially it finds other ways of utilising those skills. So as we said about the law, graduate might not be using their knowledge of property law anymore, but they're using their transferable skills in another place as well. Today, I don't think any of that research, onto your second question, has kind of looked at it from a kind of an EDI perspective that I'm aware of. So I think that would be an interesting way to look at it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that policies around how we engage with organisations in terms of improving managerial practices could in turn lead to skill underutilisation being less of a problem. So it's not necessarily kind of there's a policy thing here and there's a management thing here. So I think that's probably the type of thing we probably need to look at with the Productivity Institute as well. When we think about productivity and management practices and how good and bad practices might shape workforce productivity.
Oh, I saw lots of hands, but if you can hold those for a minute while we turn to the Zoom audience. This is very much in line with our dual teaching practices to keep both audience equally involved.
We have plenty of questions coming in, which is great to see. I'm going to put two questions to you, Anthony, actually, on a similar vein to the previous question, actually. One is, does Anthony see a role for trade unions in helping towards a solution to this important issue? And secondly, how can governments deal with skill discrimination, especially discrimination problems due to ethnic differences?
Great, so two questions there. So on the trade union issue, I think this comes back to the omission from the presentation about institutional factors, I guess, as well. You could consider the one cause of skill underutilisation or mismatches is this process of economic and technological transformation. Yeah, so essentially over time, as technology and industry changes, our workforce is being reskilled and so forth. So you could probably argue that to some extent, in some countries, back to that 1980s example of deindustrialising Manchester, maybe they kind of coped better with those transformations, and there were kind of partnership models there involving trade unions in those countries as well. Whereas in the UK, perhaps that kind of role wasn't as strong. So that's something definitely to look at. On the second question, I think hopefully the second part of my presentation touched on that in terms of ethnic discrimination in the labour market. I think the monitoring agenda is very clearly there. I think many of the kind of the objectives of broader equality, diversity, and inclusion policy could help to in turn alleviate these issues. So back to that kind of more economistic way of thinking about these frictions in matching, essentially whether they occur at the point of recruitment or they occur in terms of promotional pathways and stuff like that. So I think there's definitely more research needs to be done on what works in organisations in terms of strong evaluation. I mean, a lot of equality and diversity policy may be kind of we get the corporate view on it rather than kind of robust scientific evaluation. But I think these are the basic lessons, such as kind of the tone from the top, or there's leadership on these issues that is supported from the top. There's effective monitoring in the workplace, and there's effective action plans based upon that monitoring and so forth. So I think some of the broader ambitions of that kind of agenda could in itself help relieve some of the kind of the issues we're talking about today.
Okay, back to the audience side. Imran.
Hi, I'm Imran. I'm a lecturer here at the business school in resource management and project studies. My question is, considering that of late there has been so much exposure and discussion about these issues, do you feel when you review the evidence of the past 10, 15 years that things are getting better, considering such strong stigma is attached to anybody or any manager who would be accused of any form of discrimination? So do you see, based on that things are getting better, and are the statistics telling that story?
Wow, that's a big one. Yeah, I think the public discourse or the management discourse has definitely moved on. People are talking about things that perhaps people who've been engaging in debates such as kind of gender equality for decades and decades, and maybe even in a business school, we're seen as more kind of like peripheral to what business schools are about, and are very much central to kind of corporate social responsibility debates, ESG debates and so forth these days. So I think the public discourse around it has definitely moved on, and the acknowledgement in policy. Now, there's another side to that as well, isn't there? So there's one argument is that at the same time, we see kind of backlashes to those policies. We see kind of, problems of racism still kind of within society. And there's a question of whether some of the research looks at kind of the nature of things like racism and discrimination has kind of changed. So perhaps the manager might not be as publicly overt about their discrimination, or whether it's based on sex, gender, or another protected characteristic, but it's happening in other kind of more subtle or covert ways. And that's been a big debate, I think, in America as well. So the question there leaves, what point then does the statistics start breaking down? Because those things are clearly less kind of open to kind of observation, and they become, like you say, a point of hearsay and opinion. And then I think, so that's a part of it. So I think at the same time as kind of the public debates moved on, things have also got more complex to actually understand the situation as well. It's a short answer, but thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a big one.
Yes.
Hi, Katie Jones from Manchester Business School. I just had a question. Do you think that, to what extent do you think that the relationship between skills underutilisation and discrimination is mediated by broader characteristics of the jobs that people go into? So, for example, the sort of prevalence of people in part-time work or in low-paid sectors, and whether or not you're able to look at that from the data that you presented.
Yeah, so in the actual data here, we kind of treat part-time employment noise, which probably is not a good thing. We just control for it. But yeah, what we do know, for example, that part-time jobs are often more or lower skilled. And clearly issues of, again, it's probably a question for Jill, kind of gender segmentation stuff still are there between kind of more male-dominated and female-dominated jobs. I think it's something to look at. I think in the paper I did introduce a measure of gender composition in the actual paper, but I've not reported it here today. Yeah, so it is an issue. So, and I guess we talked about discrimination in terms of the labour market, but there are other things linked to the issue. It's clearly here. So we could, like, I mentioned the example of a person downgrading their job because of maternity, following maternity leave to a part-time, low-skilled job. So there's issues here about kind of childcare, affordability, and availability. These are more like what I'm calling institutional factors. There's issues about the quality of part-time jobs. So there's just, the assumption that part-time jobs should be lower skilled jobs. So you think about something like the Timewise Foundation in the UK is looking at how can you create more quality senior level jobs as well. So definitely think that those type of issues are quite germane. It's not so kind of direct discrimination by the line manager, but it's more structural issues around gender and employment, for example.
Yeah, maybe I could just actually use chair's privilege to follow on that. I mean, I just, some of my own research, there was an organisation that was really trying to avoid discrimination and had many rules and was doing really quite well on gender discrimination. But they included in promotion an assessment for potential. And that was the only score on which there appeared to be gender discrimination, whereas on actual performance in the current job, women were scoring as well as the men, but as soon as potential came in, and I just was thinking, well, if you had any reflections on, the role of stereotyping and expectations that actually leads to these problems. So it's that sort of discretionary assessment. It's not necessarily the assessment in current jobs, but how people feel about where their capacity or interest in moving forward, without actually necessarily asking the people concerned.
Yeah. There's two really interesting points that come from that. One is this idea of the gates. So basically, these assessments are kind of maybe a gate to whether a person kind of moves up in a job or gets promoted. So back to your initial question, Fiona, about ways we can look at that. There is kind of big data opportunities in terms of crunching and coding performance evaluations and seeing, what type of words are used in the evaluation for example, women compared to men. I think there's some focus on in terms of like it's in Silicon Valley. I know I'm aware of recently got a book chapter on discrimination in a very large firm, I won't mention here, but just read the book. But I think, alleged discrimination. But I think the issue is, you know, that when you look at some of those some of that evidence, you know, are women more being described in things like personality traits rather than on performance or attributes? And, you know, so that's a very clear exercise you can do and use more modern technological ways of crunching the actual text scripts of evaluations and things like that to try to find out and tease out those type of like more, it's back to this what we said about subtle biases. Maybe we need new tools to examine the subtle biases. Maybe the manager's not going to come out and overtly say something like they would in the past, but maybe it's those subtleties in language and discourse that might reveal, maybe the kind of data analytics and stuff like that provides opportunities to tease out those types of issues that we've not had in the past. So I think it's a really good point there.
We've just got time to take one or two more questions from the Zoom.
Okay. Are there any organisations that we can hold up as good examples of actually providing the opportunities and outcomes? Who is doing it well and what can we learn from them?
I actually knew that question was coming.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to say, publicly being recorded on video. Another thing I would suggest out loud, but if you email me, I will.
Right. Okay.
I can send you some kind of resources from other organisations if I'm not advocating.
Okay. In which case, let's have one. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the extent to which behaviour change and improved practice can be driven by mandating particular employment practice, e.g. pay gap reporting, action to address and identify barriers, failures, etc., compared to industry approaches.
So yeah, I think the question here is more about harder regulation compared to more softer voluntary measures, I guess. So, you know, do you just leave it to businesses to voluntarily decide to take actions, or do you mandate it? Again, I won't cover all the evidence in a sentence on this. I'll say I was an expert on all of it, but I think it's a huge debate. I mean, we could think about things like like board membership issues, and I guess UK historically has taken a more voluntary approach to this. It's you know, in terms of objectives for the FTSE companies, say, well, we've got this aspiration to increase number of women in terms of senior board positions. Whereas in Europe, you might see countries that have taken a more regulatory approach, for example, of enforced quotas. I think I'll probably cop out of this question and say it's probably too hard to tell. I mean, there has been a lot of movement in the FTSE in terms of improving levels of representation, but which works better in which context. I think it's probably, you know, slightly too early to send that type of example. Just before I go, one final question I must ask you, which is a very interesting one to come in, is it actually in an organisation's interests to level out opportunities? Is it a standard tool of management to create divides in the workforce along the lines of favoured and non-favoured? Wow, that's the real politics. See the industrial relations people join us on the. Yeah, no, well, we can see examples where organisations do use divide and rule and conflicts as a tool. I mean, think about where one factory is pitched against another, or something like that. In terms of, you know, think about European Works Councils and some examples of that there. I wouldn't say that would override the general concern of organisations, at least from the top, that they should be supporting development of staff to its fullest capabilities and be concerned by things happening in their workplace that are contrary to that. But accepting that, you know, maybe at the role of the line manager, lower down the organisation, there may be incentives to more different types of behaviours as well. Yeah. So I don't think that's a very, very, very clear question, but I would hope that the argument that this is a problem for the business would outweigh the more Machiavellian natured in the organisation there. but fundamentally, it's also an issue that we recognise that sometimes the interests of management and workers are not necessarily aligned, and there might be implicit conflicts
of interest around these issues as well. So we can't take this kind of unitarist approach, assuming that they're all gunning for this one better cause, but when there's a plurality of different interests in an organisation often.
Well, on that note, I think we should bring it to a close. I think we do have an opportunity at this point with all the discussion about skill shortages, perhaps point to managers that they actually do have the opportunity to look at that skills underutilisation within their own workforces and try to do something about that to actually resolve some of their skill shortages. So thanks very much for a very topical and very important discussion. So I think Fiona is going to close.
I'll just close. And I think Jill might be pleased because I have written down management practices are so important for skill utilisation. And of course, not just managers or leaders at the top, but also middle managers, because sometimes it's the middle managers that really have to implement things. Sometimes it's easier at the top to make the statements. It's at the different levels that then it has to be executed. And just like somebody on the Zoom, while I might not have been thinking about specific organisations to identify or to think who might be role models to make things better, but I was thinking what works, what are the policies that work? Often we know what doesn't work, but what's really helpful is trying to think through what works and then also making sure that what works is sustained, because that's always another issue in the policy arena. So can I just thank Anthony for sharing his insights with us today and for Jill for facilitating the discussion. Amazing questions here and online, which have been really thought-provoking. We do often make our speakers work very hard, and before we know it, Anthony might be being asked to do a blog and follow up on some of those questions. There we go. But it was a really great presentation. I'm sure just a taster of all the amazing work that Anthony is doing, and that there will be many opportunities to hear more. So can I just say that we do have an amazing series of events planned for both people face-to-face and also for colleagues online. And there are links for future lectures, which we, I think, are going to share in the chat function now. I would like to specifically highlight the annual Teddy Chester lecture, which is taking place on the 16th of November. So I think that's the week after next, where we're going to be hearing from Dr. Mark Britnell, who's Vice Chair and Global Health Expert at KPMG UK, and he's going to be discussing his thoughts around solving the global workforce crisis in healthcare. So very much kind of related issue, and I imagine that I'll be seeing many of the audience here and online come back for that. And I'm afraid for those of you who are on Zoom, you won't be able to join the face-to-face audience. We will be going off, I hope, now to have some drinks in the AMBS reception to thank Anthony for his lecture, but there will be opportunities, I hope, for you to join us in the future. So thank you very much again, and thank you, Anthony.